Namaste. My name is Dipti Vyas-Patani, and this session is brought to you as part of the Hindu Women's Festival 2021. This 5-day festival is a celebration of womanhood and femininity and will consist of a series of interactive and inspiring sessions on a variety of topics. I'm honoured to have with me today Shivani Pala. Shivani is a market intelligence director by day, and she is also mother to a 6-year-old Ridan, which is a full-time job at the best of times, but I'm sure it has been even more challenging over the past year.
Definitely.
Shivani is also authoring an essay entitled Breaking the Cycle, It Bloody Matters, which is a look at Hindu and dharmic practices around menstrual health. This essay will subsequently be submitted to the Beyond the Bindi anthology, which is a collection of thoughts on Hindu perspectives on womanhood and femininity. So welcome, Shivani.
Thank you so much, Dipti. I'm really excited to be able to share some of what I've been researching for this particular piece. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And so, Shivani, let's dive straight into it. What made you choose this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for me personally, menstruation, periods have always been something that I've thought deeply about over the years. I'm someone who had an early onset of periods. So this is quite a candid account, but I'm quite open to sharing it with all. I started my periods when I was around 9 years old, when I just turned 9 years old, which is obviously very early. And since then, I've really been on a journey with menstruation. I've battled with poor menstrual and reproductive health. And my early memories of menstruation are quite traumatic, to say the least. I've had irregular periods, menorrhagia when I do bleed, lots of vomiting, severe cramping, fainting, countless visits to the hospital. I know I've even fainted in the workplace before, and yeah, it's even resulted in reproductive health issues later in life for me. So I guess as I grew older, through conversations with friends and other women of menstruating age, and those who have stopped menstruating as well, it was really clear that these kind of issues and problems weren't just limited to me. I noticed through my conversations that countless women actually experience similar issues. And so this led me to ask more questions, especially since juxtaposed to some of these accounts from women of this day and age, when I was speaking to women of elder generations, particularly my grandmother's time and other women who she knew, it became quite clear that problems like we're experiencing today in today's society were not as prevalent as they are now back in the days when our grandmothers and their sort of fore-grandmothers and mothers were menstruating. And so it really led me to ask even further questions. I remember a conversation that I had with my husband's bar in India. She was nearing sort of the 100 mark when I actually met her, and she was someone who in her lifetime had conceived 18 times. So she'd given birth to 18 children, and obviously that's within the context of access to medicine at the time. So it wasn't necessarily that all of these children necessarily survived. And also around that time, women were getting married earlier, they were procreating earlier. So that does obviously also increase the chances of having more pregnancies. But the fact that she was able to conceive 18 times was astounding to me, especially when women in today's society, and obviously through my own experience, are having issues with conceiving one. You know, there are problems that exist in society now. And I thought, well, what is it about women of that time and before that is different from what we currently do and how we look after our sort of menstrual and reproductive health?
Yeah.
And so it just seemed like a natural process for me to be thinking about these particular issues. I think secondary to that as well, just wanted to touch on the fact that I come from a relatively progressive family who talked openly about periods as I was growing up. My brother, my father, they would generally know when I was on my period, and it wasn't necessarily a taboo subject. So I've never really grown up with this whole idea that menstruation and periods are taboo. But one thing that was always there was my grandmother, who lived with us for much of our younger life, and she often said to me things like, which I'm sure you will have experienced as well, Dipti: don't go into the mandir when you're on your period, don't touch certain foods, don't wash your hair until the 4th day. These are all things that my grandmother told me. You agree, right? And I didn't really question it much. I did think it was a bit odd, but nonetheless, I respected her wishes, and I didn't do those things in our family home. This became even more pronounced after I got married. I married into what many would term a more traditional family, who practiced some of these things around menstrual health in a much more pronounced way. So, for example, I wouldn't be able to go into the kitchen and cook for the family at that time. I know that there were certain families within the community of my husband where menstruating women were told to eat separately from the rest of the family. And I remember at the time sort of speaking to my husband and vehemently rejecting these ideas and these practices. It just didn't sit right with me. And I'd have these discussions with friends around some of these practices, and really at those times really found them quite outdated. And I think probably the thing that I found most annoying is that when I questioned some of these practices, nobody had the answers for me, or were able to tell me why we were doing them. And that's kind of led me on this quest to find out more, I guess. And that's where my piece arises.
Thank you, Shivani. That's thank you for being so candid, actually, because it's quite daunting to share your personal experiences on a public platform. And I'm in agreement with you that growing up, these practices were in my home too, and I just did them because I was told to, but didn't necessarily understand it. But as my own life has evolved, I perhaps now think back to what my grandma had told me, and I think actually maybe she did have a point. Why was she saying that? Actually, when she said to me, for example, don't go to the gym when you're on your period. So well, why did she say that? There must have been a reason, but of course she couldn't articulate it. But why did she say it? And did I actually do long-term damage to myself by ignoring her and going off to the gym when I was on my period?
I've often asked the same questions, Dipti. Could I have done anything better if I'd understood why some of these practices were in place, right? And that's not to say that we should feel guilty. The information needs to be accessible to us, and I guess that's the whole point here. If one person can start that conversation and bring it to light, I think there's lots of people in India who are talking about these things now, and we're seeing more literature come out, some great authors on this subject, but less so here. And being able to share some of what I've learned with humility, I don't know everything, it's great to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm intrigued myself because I'm learning so much just through talking to you. So thank you. So in terms of your essay, then, what is the main message, or what are the main messages that you're trying to deliver to the reader?
Yeah, good question. I think so. My piece, as you've already mentioned, is called "Breaking the Cycle. It Bloody Matters."
I love that. By the way.
Thank you. So when I talk about breaking the cycle, I think it's all around breaking the stigmas associated with menstruation, and I mean that very much from a cultural lens. And I think there's probably two stigmas that need to be addressed around menstrual health. What was actually called Rajaswala Paricharya in ancient times, and I think the stigma that I'd like to break is that you know, some of these practices that we had around menstrual health, they weren't just superstitious and backwards with no basis. There was actually a lot of science and robust ancient knowledge systems that kind of created what was known as Rajaswala Paricharya. And so I want people to understand that better. Yeah. And I think we can when we look deeper, we see that the sciences that were expounded by our shastras or our sacred texts were really quite profound in the way in which they thought about these things, and the things that they prescribed were in the best interests of the menstruating woman. So we'll get into that in more detail afterwards. But secondly, I think there's a lot of good work going on by various organizations across the globe right now to, I think, break the taboos that exist around menstruation. And I don't take away from any of the good work that is being done. I think there's lots of organizations that are trying to make that sort of open dialogue around menstruation happen. But what I have found, and what really sort of annoys me, is that there's a lot of cultural bashing that takes place in the midst of all of that. And I think sometimes from women within our own culture who don't understand the Vedic science, and that's no fault of their own, right? Like I said, the information is not accessible. So what happens is that not only from the outside are we being told that actually the way that Hindu Dharma deals with menstruating women is very backward, but we get our own women perpetuating that narrative. Yeah. So I guess I want to break some of that stigma. I'm advocating for us to have a culture of open dialogue, to show people the way forward in the way we can discuss some of these things. And I think also that means breaking that narrative that Indic and dharmic traditions view menstruating women as impure, dirty, some of the words that we always see associated with menstruation, particularly from this cultural framework. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. I mean, the dominant narrative at the moment seems to be that actually these ancient practices around menstruation and menstrual health are very backward and are actually demeaning and degrading to women, and that is the dominant narrative. And I, feel less woke because I'm not satisfied with that narrative. I don't agree with it. My nanny, my maternal grandmother, had said to me, "Don't go to a temple when you're on your period." And I don't go to, even now, I won't go to a temple when I'm on my period, because for me, that is respect. I don't know why. And I think maybe I'm hoping you'll touch on it a bit later on, but, I won't do it because for me, it's respect for the deity. And equally, I'm a practicing Hindu, but I wouldn't actually go to a gurdwara or a church when I'm on either. It's just that sort of respect. So I don't know. I agree with you, and actually, I think what you're trying to do, if I may say so, is perhaps putting forward an alternative narrative so people have the opportunity to consider both and make an informed choice. Whereas I think, the reason for these ancient practices, I suppose, has not been articulated so much into the mainstream.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It is providing that alternative narrative. And I'm glad you mentioned the word woke, actually, because that the whole woke culture that we see today, it's just so prevalent around any topic or issue. I think it's the general, and social media perpetuates this as well, right? It's this whole jumping on the bandwagon of something that is trending right now. I'm not saying everyone does it, but there is a tendency to do that. And I feel that's okay. We can be woke if we have done the necessary research to dig deeper and go beneath the skin of an issue and really understand it from its roots. So I guess what I'm advocating for is that positive inquiry in all of us, right? And I've been part of that woke culture. This is not me putting myself on a higher platform. I've said that I've vehemently rejected some of these practices up until not so recently. Do you know what I mean? Until I've gone on this journey with trying to find out more. So it'd be great if we can all do that.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't actually know where to start researching on on this topic, because I imagine there's a lot of material on it. So where did you start your research?
Yeah.
Where has it sort of taken you?
Yeah, so I guess when it comes to menstruation and the practices surrounding it, I think there's numerous questions that arise for women, particularly from our Indic cultures, right? Many of those questions are focused around, for example, why can we not enter a temple during menstruation? Menstruation is a God-given thing. Why are we not allowed to be before God? Are we seen as dirty? Are we seen as impure? Why can't we wash our hair until the 4th day? Why are we restricted from eating certain foods when we're on our period, right? And to most of us, when we look at it logically and from the lens of modern society, it does seem really alarming and backwards that we can't do a lot of these things. And I think more so than that, when we search for the answers, it's very difficult to find those answers in one place. And I think much of this, when I sort of dug deeper, much of this is because we don't have one holy book like many of the Abrahamic faiths do. Our scriptures, or our shastras, our sacred texts, they are vast and they're spread across a number of different types of books, and they generally fall into 4 camps, right? So we have the shrutis, that which is heard, and that was what the sages and rishis of a certain era or epoch of time are shared with the community at large. Then there's the smritis, which came later, the Purana and the Itihas, so the stories, and then there's also Tantra Shastra, right? And so I think what I found really interesting in my quest for answers was actually the science around Tantra. And I think in the West, and this is something else that we should talk about at some point, but in the West, the meaning of Tantra, it's really been reduced to an understanding of esoteric kind of sexual practices, right? That help people achieve some kind of spiritual nirvana. But actually, this is my bugbear, because again, it's a language thing, right? There are so many things within our dharmic traditions that have beautiful words to explain the depth and meaning behind what that particular thing means, but there are no equivalent English words to really do justice to that depth of meaning, right? And Tantra is one of those things, and that's why it's been reduced to what I've said to you. And actually, there's a far deeper meaning, and the practices surrounding it are not just limited to sex as the West perceives it to be. I think to really grasp this, we have to have an understanding of human existence from a Hindu perspective, right? So from a Hindu perspective, human existence is said to belong to the 4 yugas. So I think I just touched on it before, but the yugas refer to like epoch ages, right? And they were known as the Satya Yug, or the Krita Yug, the Treta Yug, the Dwapara Yug, and the Kal Yug, which we are in right now. And each yug is actually associated with a decreasing ability of humans to actually attain moksha or spiritual liberation, which is actually, according to our dharma, the ultimate goal of human life is to achieve moksha, right? And so I think when I looked deeper into this, according to each yug, a different type of our shastras or sacred text are appropriate for helping individuals achieve that spiritual liberation. So in the time of the golden age, the golden epoch, Satya Yuga, the Vedas, that which was heard by the sages and the rishis, were the predominant mode of helping people achieve that spiritual liberation. In the Treta Yuga, fewer people had that capacity to enter samadhi and reach that spiritual liberation. So at that time, it was the shrutis, so that which was remembered, which became sort of almost like, I say this loosely, the Bible for which people sort of moved towards mukti and spiritual liberation. And there were more sort of rules and regulations within the shrutis. Then as we moved into Dwapara Yuga, again, the ability and the human capacity of people to achieve spiritual liberation became even more diminished, right? And in this time, they had to simplify the knowledge that was in the Veds and the Shmrutis to simple stories, which, whilst they were simple stories, they carried far deeper meaning. And these were called the Puranas and the Itihas.
Yeah.
And they were stories designed to help people understand the Vedas.
Yeah.
And then lastly, you've got the Kal Yuga, which I said is the era that we're in today. And the human capacity to achieve self-realization is at its absolute lowest in this age. So basically, people are more focused on the pursuit of worldly pleasures during this particular era. And so it was really difficult to get people to walk towards mukti and spiritual liberation. It is very difficult, not was, it is. Sorry?
Definitely feels like Kal Yuga right now.
Exactly, especially with everything going on around us, right? So this is where the Tantra Shastra comes in. So moving back towards that the word of Tantra, which we've already just focused on, Tantra Shastra, or these sacred texts, we use as a way of accessing the teachings of the Veda and walking towards mukti in this particular era.
Yeah.
And firstly, you need a guru to be able to do that. It's really difficult to achieve samadhi in this era without the help of a guru. And secondly, it requires sadhana, which is spiritual practice, right? Continued spiritual practice, and that can be done through a variety of different modes, whether that's yoga for some people, meditation, bhakti, whatever it might be. I don't want to go too far into it, otherwise we won't have enough time for the rest of the session.
Yeah.
But it requires these kinds of things to experience it. Yeah. And yes, some people also use sex in some form to achieve that samadhi as well, through the channeling of sexual energy, for example, to raise the kundalini as part of a spiritual process. But that's one facet of it. So we shouldn't reduce the whole of Tantra to this one area.
Actually,
sorry,
just to interject there, I think as part of the Hindu Women's Festival, I think there is actually a whole session on Tantra. So anybody who's watching and is interested in learning more.
Fantastic. I'll be plugging into that myself, I think. So I guess you find answers to the questions around different menstrual health practices across all of these different books that I've mentioned, right? So some of the oldest answers to the menstrual health practices that we speak about date back to the Shrutis, so the time of the Vedas. Yeah. In particular, in the Atharva Ved, there's a lot of knowledge around Ayurveda, right, which is the ancient science of life and longevity. Yeah. And I guess we'll go into that in a bit more detail afterwards, and how that kind of gives us meaning behind some of the menstrual health practices. But the answers to why we can't enter a temple, you wouldn't find those in the Shrutis, because during the time of the Shrutis, which is the Satyayug time, actually temples weren't required as a means to help people achieve samadhi. Temples came much later, during the Kal Yuga, where I've spoken about the Tantra Shastra being the sacred text of the time. And Tantra Shastra also includes something called the Agama Shastras, which contains things like regulations or rules around temple design, construction, and how we consecrate a place of worship as well. And within these Agama Shastras, if you understand temple design and temple construction and consecration, I say consecration loosely, we'll come on to that a bit later. If we understand these practices, we get a better understanding again of why we don't enter a temple. But can you see how, like, it's so vast and it's almost mind-blowing? You can find the answers across all these different books and for different ages as well.
Absolutely. And I absolutely want to hear more about all of these different sort of areas that you've mentioned. But something I've just been thinking about as you were talking is that, it sounds like there's so much information, there's a wealth of information in all of these texts, but why do we not really know about it, or why are they not really that accessible? What do you think the reason for it is?
It's such a good question. I think there are 2 points here. So I think firstly, when I dug deeper on this, it goes hand in hand with the destruction of ancient Indian sciences, right? So when you look across these books, actually, there's a real science behind why we have some of these menstrual health practices to protect the health of the menstruating woman. And ancient Indian sciences were sort of knowledge systems that we've known since time immemorial, right? And then progressively, India became invaded again and again, right? So we've got the Mohammedan rule, right? So the Muslim invasions, whether that's the Mughal Empire or otherwise, when this happened, there was basically a decline in Indian medicine. There was a lack of government support for Indian medicine, and there was basically unrest across the country due to these invasions. This then got revived a little bit during the times of the Peshwa rule, so the Marathi rule, and again, sort of intellectuals were allowed to rise again. There was the institutions came back and universities came back, and the spread of education continued to happen. So some of the text pertaining to or the Indian sciences were then penned again at that time, and people became more cognizant of them. But then straight after that, in the 1800s, you then get the British Empire and colonizers. And when that happened, there was no turning back, essentially. This basically, I guess, resulted in the decline of native medical sciences as we knew them. What happened then was you get colonizers establishing medical schools based on knowledge of allopathic medicine, so Western medicine, right? And basically they suppressed the growth and the promotion of our native Indian sciences, which India used to be so knowledgeable on, and everything used to operate around some of these sciences. So that was part of it. And then secondly, just touching on sort of the Western narratives that continue to be perpetuated. So in modern times and in modern society, I guess the practices around menstrual health that are rooted in ancient Indian science and expounded by our Shastras, which we've already talked about, they're now just deemed backwards and oppressive to women, right? And again, that goes back to the point that people don't understand them because, like you say, that information is no longer accessible in a finite way. And then it's the rhetoric that continues to get perpetuated in society, and we all know about Western media and what that does, right? Once Western media gets hold of something, we see that rhetoric continue to play out. And particularly around sort of menstruation, we saw that play out in such a profound way during the Sabrimala case, the Sabrimala temple in South India, where women between the ages of 10 and 50 who are going through their menstrual cycles are not allowed to enter that temple at any time. And this was turned into a huge furor in the media, as I'm sure you're aware of. And basically our culture was vilified because of it, and this was due to the Western narrative compounding this, and people not really going back to the Shastras and the teachings that we have, the ancient Vedic sciences. And yeah, it's really upsetting, really, that this happened. Essentially, we see this across the world, right? These ancient knowledge systems, I think when I was speaking to you earlier, Dipti, I was talking about how these ancient knowledge systems, they're not just restricted to India, right? The world over, there are synergies around some of these menstrual practices. I know Nitin Sridhar, who's written a fantastic book around menstruation across cultures. He talks about how restrictions around menstrual health are not just done within our culture. It's something that also Abrahamic faiths like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they all have certain restrictions around menstrual health, and basically, though there were native native indigenous people who also understood why some of these practices were done at the time that some of our ancient seers and ancient knowledgeable people were practicing Vedic sciences in our country, right? But those cultures also got destroyed by whether it was European invasions and missionaries at the time.
Yeah,
it was going on world over. You know, you also see sort of witches were burnt at the stake, and some of those what we term as witches, some of them were the sort of the traditional healers of the time, people who understood the sciences. So it's kind of happened world over, I think. Yeah.
And great you're bringing this information, because it's like you said, this information is contained across a variety of books and texts, but it's not really accessible, and perhaps, you know, because of the language as well, particularly in the West. And it's great that you're you know, you're writing about it from the perspective of a British Hindu woman. So, you know, thoroughly looking forward to reading that piece, actually. Something that I've you mentioned earlier on was Ayurveda, and something that I'm very interested in, and becoming more interested in as time goes on. Could you talk a little bit about that and menstrual health?
Yeah, definitely. I think before I go into that, actually, I wanted to touch on something which kind of plays into Ayurveda as well to some degree, and sort of health in general. And our positive attitudes around health and menstrual health. So there was a time in India where the onset, and there still is today actually, particularly in South India, this is still practiced.
Yeah.
But there was a time across the whole of India where this was practiced.
Yeah.
Essentially, when a woman started menstruating or starts menstruating, there is celebration of menarche in the woman. It happens in a huge way in the south of India today. So the first period in women is celebrated, which really touches upon the reverence that was traditionally given to menstruating women across India. Like I said, we still see this reverence in certain parts of India, particularly in the south, where the onset of menarche is celebrated openly in front of men and women alike. And I think this is a great thing. It was not only was it a way of showing reverence and respecting the menstruating women, but it also provided a really positive experience of menstruation for women. And I think this is something that we can't belittle, right? When I think about my own menstrual health journey, I often think, and conversations that I have with my friends, when we talk about our periods, we're always quick to say, oh God, I can't, it's nearly time of the month. I just can't do this. I hate my period. I'm going to feel disgusting. You kind of go, I don't know about you, but you go into your period with a negative attitude. It's hugely prevalent in urban women. I think there's a real negative association with menstruation. I know I've experienced it in a very heightened way. Like I said, having suffered for years, actually, it's been something that's continued to be perpetuated, and I've always dreaded being on my period. And this becomes like a self-perpetuating cycle where you're stressed all the time, you're in a negative state of mind before you even start your period on a monthly basis. And like anything in life, when you see something as positive, it's likely that the experience will be more positive.
Yeah.
Does that resonate? What I'm
absolutely. I agree with you that when I was due to start my period, all I could think about was the bloating, and my face is going to get puffy, and just dread that time of the month. But as life has evolved, actually I think, well, it's a blessing to have a period, because what that means is actually I am still able to have a child, and actually it's my opportunity. That's God's sign to me to say, actually, you are still able to have a child, and also it's my opportunity to withdraw from the world and rest. So actually, when my nanima or my grandmother said, don't come into the kitchen, actually maybe that was the historic reason for us, for women not entering the kitchen, because actually it was their opportunity to rest.
Yeah, Yeah, that is definitely one of the reasons. And you're so right. I mean, when we talk about this whole, it's great that you're able to see your periods like that. And I think I've only been able to do that after having had a child, actually.
Yeah.
Personally, and again, it's because of this narrative that I said, or this self-talk that my period's going to be bad, my period's going to be bad. Not only that, if you look at society around us, we've even got an aversion to referring to periods as they are. We use a number of different euphemisms to describe our period. I think a Guardian article that I read that was written in 2018 or something says that worldwide there's 5,000 slang terms to refer to period, and not all of them are nice. You have things like which actually showcase the negative connotations around periods. So things like Shark Week, on the rag, Crimson Tide, all of these kinds of terms, they spring to mind. They're all very negative in their output. And so while some of them seem funny and we joke about them, they continue to perpetuate this shame around periods, and that's what kind of continues to grow that taboo. And if we perpetuate that negativity, we stop that ability to openly talk about them. That makes sense. And I think traditionally in India it was a very different approach, right? This celebration of menarche at the beginning of one's journey with periods was this amazing way of saying to the woman, look at this life-giving force that you have, right? Honor it, respect it, celebrate it. And it was a way of giving the woman this really positive experience right from the outset. And these ceremonies were conducted in such a lavish way, still are today, men and women invited, and all the foods that are conducive and all the rituals that are conducive to you having rich menstrual health, they were all practiced in that celebration period, and the girl was looked after as deity herself, like as Shakti herself, right? Which is really beautiful when we think about it like that. And it's actually it's creating this menstrual memory, this positive menstrual memory, so that all subsequent periods after that will hopefully be a positive experience as well.
Because there's that feeling that I'm special.
Exactly. And that does tie into, I know you asked me about Ayurveda, so that ties back into that. So do you want to ask me again what you were saying around Ayurveda?
Absolutely. So, you mentioned Ayurveda earlier, and it's something that I've developed a keen interest in over the past few years. And I just wanted to understand, the science of Ayurveda, and what is some of the what is the impact on menstrual health?
I'm going to try and explain it in a shortened form. I mean, the science in Ayurveda is so in depth, and I'm still on my journey of learning. But from the research that I've done so far and my understanding, I think the importance of Ayurveda and other forms of dharmic practices such as yoga really help us, I think, understand the Hindu practices around menstrual health, right? So I guess modern medicine and science, or Western medicine, they predominantly operate or function at that layer of the gross physical body, what we know as the Sthula Sharir, right? Whereas the ancient Indian sciences, which we've been speaking about, have a much deeper understanding of the body. So here, the body is said to be comprised of Panchakosha, right? Or five different sheaths, which includes the physical body, so that which is sustained by food. That's called the Annamaya Kosha. And then 4 other sheaths which comprise of the Sukshma Sharir, or the subtle body. So 3 of the sheaths actually comprise the Sukshma Sharir. And when we look at it from the context of modern medicine, we can sort of think about this or understand this from the realm of quantum biology, which is more of a recent understanding when it comes to modern medicine. And then there's the Karuna Sharir, which is the ultimate bliss sort of sheath, and that's the one that allows us to be closer to spiritual liberation. But essentially these 5 sheaths, they act as the layers of body that cover the Atma, the soul. And the Shrutis, the Vedas, they're asking us to eliminate all these 5 sheaths so that we can really realize the self, realize the Atma, and achieve that mukti that we've been talking about throughout this talk. So, you know, and we can do that in this day and age, we can do that through various practices such as yoga, mantra, etc. Right? Now, understanding and employing Ayurvedic practices, I think, also provides a really conducive environment in which the body can achieve this goal. So not only things like yoga, but Ayurveda kind of supports this whole functioning of being able to dispel these outer sheaths and reach the Atma. So I think, as I've said before, Ayurveda is the science of life and longevity, which basically supports humans on that journey to realization of self. And according to Ayurveda, periods were never meant to be painful, right? I know I've told you all about my experiences. I think me and you have had conversations about your experiences too, Dipti. But they were never meant to be painful. Our periods were never meant to be irregular, never meant to be heavy, regardless of how common these things have become in society today. And I think, unlike allopathy, so when allopathy being modern medicine, Ayurveda has a really fine understanding of the Sukshma Sharir, that subtle body that I've already touched upon. And it recognizes these 3 internal forces that control all of the functions within our body. And these are known as the tri-dosha. So when we say tri-dosha, we mean there are 3 doshas that exist, right? These internal forces, and they're known as Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. If these are imbalanced in the body, it can cause disease in individuals. And every individual, right, it's almost like a personalized method of medicine for each individual. Every individual has a specific prakriti arising from a combination of these doshas, right? And accordingly, these doshas influence one's own individual health. In women, it also influences menstruation. And the quality of the menstrual period, the menstrual blood, right? So this is why I say that periods were never meant to be painful, irregular, or heavy. And, you know, probably in our grandparents' time and before, they were practicing or eating according to Ayurvedic principles, and also practicing other things according to Ayurvedic principles, which resulted in them having better menstrual health all round and not having some of these ailments that seem to be so prevalent in society today. In addition to that, you know, I think we've got to recognize that Ayurveda also has, or it describes what is termed as 7 dhatus or tissue layers, and these consist of lymph, blood, flesh, fat, bone, marrow, and semen/ovum, depending on whether you're male or female. And under the influence of Pitta, which is one of those internal forces that I've described, the lymph, or the rasa, is transformed into the 6 other tissue layers that I've just described, eventually, and that happens over a period of 5 days, eventually resulting in the last one, which is semen or ovum in women. So for the purposes of this essay, let's term it ovum, right? And the menstrual blood is actually seen as a byproduct of the release of the ovum, right? We know how menstruation operates from a scientific point of view, according to Western medicine. So basically, the food we eat greatly influences the quality of the menstrual blood we produce. And hence there were strict regimes around what we eat. Not just what we eat, but certain things that we do which aggravate that pitta, that internal force, because we want the pitta to work in such a way that transformation right the way from lymph all the way to semen and ovum is fluid, right? And when the pitta can't operate and it's perturbed, then we get imbalances. And so there were strict regimes put in place, which we can find in the Ayurveda text, in the Ayurveda, and these things were called, these practices or this regimen around menstrual health practices was called Rajaswala Paricharya.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect. I think we need to think also about the prakriti, that body composition, right? So depending on what your composition is, so if you're someone that has more pitta in your body, when there are disturbances in your body composition, this can manifest in different ways when it comes to your period. So someone with pitta who has an aggravated pitta dosha may experience much heavier bleeding or things like endometriosis, for example. Equally, someone who has a different dosha makeup, whether that be vata or kapha, will experience problems in a different way when those doshas are imbalanced, right? So the ideal goal is to keep those doshas in balance through proper eating and proper Ayurvedic principles and lifestyle. And then we also, so that's Ayurveda. I then wanted to sort of move into the Agama Shastras, temple design. Was there anything you wanted to ask me first before I sort of move into the other Indic sciences, which also, along with Ayurveda, provide us with a really good understanding of why some of these practices were put in place?
Well, I was just thinking, we talked about this at the beginning. It was around your husband's grandmother who had 18 children.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking actually, these menstrual practices not only meant that they had good menstrual health, that also meant they had a probably better fertility. I mean, I read an article this morning actually which said that by 2045, most couples will be infertile because of our diet and will actually require IVF. So actually, I suppose it is worth delving into, if this is where we've come to, if we want to, why was it that generation perhaps had better menstrual health and better fertility? So it might not be a bad idea to go back to basics.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I feel really hard done by that. I didn't have access to this knowledge when I was younger, because having suffered for so long. But I agree, like, our lifestyle has shifted in such a way, right? It's the food we eat, our diets are, well, not as good as they can be. We eat on the run a lot of the time because we are busy individuals. We have different stresses to what our foremothers had. And the stress has a really big impact as well, right? So menstruation also can cause oxidative stress in our bodies as well. And if that is then compounded with external stresses, it's even worse for us. So yeah, if we could go back to some of the simple methods of eating khichdi and things laden with ghee and jaggery and dry fruits and coconut, we would probably, like was prescribed in the Rajaswala Paricharya, we'd probably be feeling much better. Yeah.
But I interrupted.
Sorry,
I interrupted earlier. You were going to go into the next.
No, that's totally fine. Yeah. So I think the next aspect of what I've learned that I would love to go into is answering this question around temples, right, and why we can't enter temples. This seems to be the prevalent question amongst all of us. I've asked it countless times, and really we have to understand two things, which the interplay of two things. Also, Ayurveda also plays a part as well. But firstly, it's temple design, which was, like I said, expounded in the Agama Shastras, which form part of the Tantra Shastra. Temple design, consecration, we need to understand that science, and we also need to understand the chakra system. So to start with sort of the design of temples, essentially temples, like I said, only even our traditional temples, our ancient temples, only existed and came to the fore within the Kali Yuga, right? Because like we said, the human capacity to achieve mukti is diminished in the Kali Yuga. And so there were temples that were put in place that made it very easy for people to step into a place of worship and be closer to achieving mukti. It's not that easy. It depends on what kind of marg you're on, bhakti marg, nivritti marg, or where, you know, what kind of a temple you are in, because different temples are designed for different things. Some temples are designed for bhukti, worldly pleasures, and some temples are designed for mukti, and spiritual enlightenment. But essentially, temples, the way there was such a science behind how temples were built. They were basically designed to mimic human physiology. So when I say that, the murti that we see in the temple is more than just stone and concrete, right? The murti, or the deity, has been consecrated. I don't really like to use that word consecrated, because again, the connotations of the West don't give enough depth or reverence to the equivalent words in our Indic sort of cultures, right? So what we call it is pran pratishta. So basically, the pandit of that temple, he undergoes sankalp. So he has an intention to bring life to that murti, right? And so a series of rituals will have been undergone with a specific intention, which gives life to that murti, right? It becomes a life form. It's not just the murti or a stone that we go and pray before. It's a living entity which has a soul, an atma. That pran that we're putting inside the murti is giving that murti a soul, right? And essentially the rest of the temple is then the extension of that soul. And often, even when you look back at some of the sacred texts, that other parts of the temple are named as parts of the body that encompasses that atma. And we basically are not breathing, but the pandit is putting chaitanya into that murti. It's the loose term, or again, the simple term for that to understand is energy. And basically, the temple is constructed around it to imbibe the qualities of the deity, or that soul that now resides within that vigraham, or the murti that's there. So I think the question then you need to ask is, how does that temple impact a human being, right? And in order to understand how that temple impacts a human being, you have to have a good understanding, a sound understanding of the chakra system, which also operates at that sukshma sharir layer that I've already spoken about. So I guess when we look at it from a modern science perspective, just as we recognize that nerves and plexus points exist within the gross body, so the physical body, you know, if you've done biology, you'll know about plexus points and nerve endings all congregating at a plexus point within the physical body. There are also subtle channels, or that are kind of equivalent to nerves, called nadis, and they all congregate at points, or plexus points, giving rise to what we know as chakra in the subtle body, in the sukshma sharir. And the ones that probably are the most important are the 6 major chakras that exist along your, or the plexus points that exist along your spinal cord. And these 6, they essentially carry the vital life force of what Hindus know as prana. And the 6 chakras that we have, there's the Muladhara chakra, which sits at our root. There's the Swadhisthana chakra, which sits in the area of the reproductive organs. There's the Manipura chakra, which is higher up in our digestive system. Then we move up towards the heart, which is the Anahata chakra. Then we have the chakra here in our throat, which is the Vishuddhi chakra. And then we have the chakra here, the Agna chakra. And then some people say there's a 7th one, which is the Sahasrara chakra, but actually is known as the seat of consciousness. So that is the point of enlightenment. And right, so all of these chakras have the ability to be energized, essentially. And the 2 lowest chakra, which I've described, the Swadhisthana chakra, responsible for reproductive health, and the Manipura chakra, responsible for digestive health, if they're not sufficiently energized, they can cause menstrual and reproductive issues, particularly the Swadhisthana chakra. And so they can really be regulated well, again, by knowledge of the Ayurveda system. So particularly the knowledge of Vata dosha. So I didn't touch on this earlier, but I mentioned the 3 doshas to you earlier, but the Vata dosha is responsible for, well, it's predominant in menstruation, right? So it aids the movement of menstrual blood through our system. And Vata dosha has 5 subtypes, and they are, well, they're responsible for the flow of energy through our body. The most important one for us to think about here is apana vayu, right? And that works in a downward motion through the Swadhisthana chakra, and it allows us to for the downward flow of our period, right? Like we all know that we need to expel this from our body, right? We all need to expel our menstrual health, and when we can't, it results in things like endometriosis, which can be hugely painful to a woman. And so when there's an obstruction of downward flow, that's when problems arise, right? So we then marry that to what we know about temples, right? So temples were, like I said earlier, built for different endpoints. So some temples were built for bhakti and helping people in their worldly affairs. Some temples were built for mukti, helping people with their spiritual liberation, their attainment of moksha, right? And so bhakti temples, the ones that operate at help people with their worldly affairs, they usually energize those lower chakras, you know, the Swadhisthana chakra, the Manipura chakra, the Muladhara. They basically help resolve health issues there. So for example, if there was someone who is experiencing reproductive health issues, you would go to a Devi temple, not whilst you're on your period, but you would go to a Devi temple and you would sit in the presence of the Devi. And because the energy, the way that the Pranapratishta has been done to invoke the Chaitanyam in that Devi, it means that your Swadhisthana chakra will be energized when you're in the presence of that Devi, right? So you would go to those temples if you're looking for help with sorting out any reproductive health problems. Now, when you are a menstruating woman and you go to a temple where actually it's the mukti temple, a temple that is helping people with that process of achieving mukti and spiritual liberation, they operate at the higher chakra level, right? So they don't operate at that layer where reproductive health is important. They operate at the particularly the Agna chakra level, right? So the Shabrimal temple was one of those temples where the Chaitanyam in the Vigraham, what's been invoked in that Vigraham is at that Agna chakra layer, right? So it's when people go there, they're much further along in their spiritual journey and they're looking to attain moksha. And a woman is not quite there yet, right? A woman who is menstruating, she's still very much living worldly pleasures. The ability to have a period is for you to be able to conceive a child, right? And so you're still very much in worldly affairs. So you wouldn't put yourself before that deity. Even more so, what happens here is it's adverse to the menstrual health of the woman if she was to go and be in a temple where the Agna chakra is energized, because you think about the Vata dosha again and the Apana vayu, right? Apana vayu wants to go downwards, right? When you're in a temple where Prana vayu, which operates at that sort of Agna chakra level, is all to do with energy going upwards and helping people's energy and life force go up through the spine and achieve that state of consciousness. When that's happening, that's going upwards and it's counterproductive to the flow of Apana vayu, which needs to go downwards. And if you might not necessarily experience it straight away, right? But like doing that again and again and progressively going into those environments in the long term can have a negative effect on your menstrual health. So
Oh,
Yeah,
I had no idea. Always been following practice. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Is there a bit of disturbance there?
tiny bit of disturbance, but I can just about grab you.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I've been following the this not going to a temple when I'm on my period, or not going to garba when I'm on period, but not really understood why I was doing it, and that's really clarified things for me. I mean, I know that people, friends who will, for example, take the pill to stop their period so they can go to garba. I mean, I suppose it's like a loophole.
Yeah, in some ways it is. Yeah, again, probably not good for your menstrual health either, you know. And this is not me preaching. I've done lots of these things, right? But understanding it now, I'm not sure whether it's something that helped me. So
yeah, exactly. You've sort of been on the other side, and you've now done so much research. So yeah, I think I think it's great that you're sharing. And when we did our research, and conscious that we're running out of time a little bit, and I feel like we could go on forever, but where do we go from here? We've got this Western narrative about menstrual health, and I'm not saying that that's wrong, because obviously a lot of research has been done, and then you've got our Hindu ancient practices that our ancestors have been following for generations. Where do we go from here?
yeah, I think it goes back to that point that you made earlier, is why is it not accessible anymore? Why do we not know this, right? And it's because we don't know it, because again, that Western narrative has been perpetuated. But if even one person is having that positive inquiry around some of these issues and is willing to take on the mantle with humility, right, and question some of these practices and help the rest of us understand, then that's some way along the journey. You know, I'm hoping by sharing through my piece for Beyond the Bindi that some of this will resonate for other people, and they will then go on, and it's a ripple effect, and we'll continue to share with more people, right? And so hopefully, as many people who have been online today and hear this talk, there'll be something that strikes a chord, right? Now, I'm not saying that we go back to practicing everything that was, was laid out in the Rajaswala Parijaya, right? Some of it might even not be contextual for our time anymore, some of it, but some of it will be. Some of it, I think it's a fine balance and working out what that is, for each one of us. I know there's still things that I'm battling with. I think we spoke about it earlier. Like I love exercising, and actually, as someone who has had polycystic ovarian syndrome and PCO, and who has an underactive thyroid, all of these things, I found actually I felt better when I was exercising. But again, I don't know the long-term effects of that, right? And it's interesting. Like, I'm going to touch on it briefly, but I've read a lot by a woman called Simi Joseph, who is a menstrual educator in India and doing such a fantastic job of educating us around some of these practices. And she does field work with the rural women of that time, of the time now, and having had accounts from people from before. But she talks about menstruating women within the sports.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a prime age between when most women will stop playing extreme sports, and 35 is apparently the cap when you on average across the globe, right? And obviously there will be anomalies to that as well, but 35 is generally the cap, because after that your bones are weak and more brittle, and you sustain more injuries. Now, according to Rajaswala Parijaya, you shouldn't do any exercise within the first 3 days of your period, because your bones are more brittle at that time. And by progressively doing it, it compounds the effect of having weaker bones. And actually, when you look at some women in India who are still practicing sports of that particular land. So in southern India, there's something called Kalyaripu, I think, and it's an ancient sword form. There's a woman in India who's 79 years old who still practices this art form, and it requires strength and stamina and resilience. And there's lots of women who are Bharatanatyam dancers, even in later age, which we know also requires strength and stamina, right? But all of these women, when Sinu Joseph interviewed these women, the reason that they've been able to carry on that practice well into their sort of 70s is because they practiced that thing that was expounded by Rajaswala Parijara, which is not to exercise within. They took the rest of those 3 days, you know, they took rest. And I think that's really, really interesting in itself. So, yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm going to put myself on mute. Right. Shivani, thank you so much. I feel like we could probably talk for another hour and still run out of time. But thank you so much for sharing your personal experiences, your research, your perspective. I feel like I've learned so much, and there's so much more. You know, I'm sure I can learn when I read your piece in Beyond Bindi. So very much looking forward to that.
Thanks, Dipti. I've really enjoyed chatting to you about it. I'd also say that there will be more about this. We've been really lucky to have Sinu Joseph herself confirm a conversation with us as part of the Hindu Women's Festival, which will be airing sometime after we've done this particular session. But I will be looking to interview. I'll be the interviewer in this case, and I'll be looking to dig deeper around some of the other practices. I know there's a lot around menstrual seclusion, etc., that people will want to know about. Also, the story of Indra, which tells us, right, it's a Purana, it's one of the Puranas, and it tells us more about how menstruation came about, and there's an association with sin, etc. So we'll dig deeper into some of those concepts as well, which I found fascinating myself. And to have Sinu herself talk about some of these things will be really interesting. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you can all join us for that one too.
Well, thank you, Shivani. Look forward to that as well.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaste.